Well, I personally would love to skydive, but I wouldn't want to do it without a parachute. And I don't think you would either. Now, today's story doesn't exactly involve somebody wanting to jump out of a plane, but could you imagine falling from a plane without a parachute? Because that's exactly what happened. Now, today's story is almost unbelievable. A 17-year-old girl falling 2 miles out of a plane, landing in the jungle, and surviving to tell the tale. So let's get into this. It was December 1971, and Julianne Kopka had been in Lima for her senior prom. She was with her mother, Maria, and they both wanted to fly back to Panguana in Peru for the Christmas holidays. It was December the 24th, i.e. Christmas Eve, and they had a flight booked. When the flight left, there was 92 people on board the aeroplane, and as they continued their journey, they actually encountered some inclement weather. As the plane continued, they noticed in the distance they were heading into a rather large storm, and the pilots on board the plane had been instructed to try and make up as much time as possible, which meant that their decision to fly through the storm rather than going around it would be one that ended in tragedy. As they entered the storm, there was a lot of turbulence. That turbulence got worse and worse, and soon there was luggage falling all over the place. Add to that, people had also brought Christmas cakes onto the plane, and they were going everywhere as well. People were being jostled from side to side in the seats, and everybody started to panic. The people on board knew that the airline itself didn't have the best safety record, and add to that, the turbulence and all the commotion, people started to panic. And as Julianne looked out of the window to the wing of the plane, she saw a bright flash of light. That was a bolt of lightning hitting the wing. From that moment on, the plane was doomed. It started to nosedive and head straight towards the ground. As it picked up speed, it started to break apart. Julianne was seated in one of 3 seats, and she was strapped in. And then all of a sudden, as the plane broke apart, she started to feel herself being sucked out of the aeroplane. And that's exactly what happened. The chairs with her in it were suddenly no longer in the plane, and they were plummeting towards the ground. Julianne, as she's falling, suddenly notices that her mother, who had been sat next to her, was no longer there. And her own recollection is that of just hearing the wind rushing past her ears as she picked up speed. Now, she was falling from around about 2 miles above the ground, and it took quite a while for her to actually get near the ground, but by that time she had passed out. It would be 20 hours later when Julianne actually woke up. She knew the time because she had a watch on, and she looked down. It was 9 o'clock in the morning, and she was soon able to put all the pieces together about how long she'd actually been on the floor. She was covered in mud, it was raining, and as she lay there dazed on the floor, she's looking up into the canopy, the tree canopy above, and she also saw the seats that she had been in, and they were above her too. And she's cold, she's freezing, and she's badly injured. She has a broken collarbone, she has a gash on her right arm, and she has a torn ACL. She had also been concussed for those 20 hours. As she gathered in her surroundings, she realised that she was getting rained on, and so to hide from the rain, she actually moved underneath the seats for some kind of protection. She didn't have the right type of clothing for that environment. She was wearing just a sleeveless mini dress, and realistically, you're in the jungle. This isn't going to keep you warm. Now, the next 36 hours for Julianne would see her going in and out of consciousness. She had just fallen from a plane, and here she was now, freezing cold, wet. She was injured, but she finally got her composure together, and she realised that I can't stay here anymore, I have to go. So she gathered herself and she started to walk. She made her way through the forest, and she was looking for some kind of water source, She remembered her father saying when she was a child that if you get lost in the jungle, you need to find a water source and follow it to its source, because that will lead you to a bigger water source, and eventually that will take you to civilization. So that's what she did. She made her way towards the nearest water source. Luckily for her, that was a spring. She was able to drink from the spring, and she followed the source. And as she's following the source, she finally sees some wreckage from the plane. She realizes that there may be something there that could assist her, so she starts to have a look around. She finds some sweets on the floor, and that's the only sustenance that she will have in the entire time that she is lost. But she finds them, she eats a couple, and she saves the rest, knowing that these may be the only food that she's going to eat. Now, as daytime turned to nighttime, she would huddle up on the banks. She would try to stay as warm as she could, but she had no fire, she had no clothing, and it was bitterly cold at night in the jungle. Now, luckily for her, she had, for the past few years, been living in the jungle. Her mother was an ornithologist and her father was a zoologist. They worked at the Peruvian research station, and she was well aware of all the dangers that the jungle held. And so her experience of having lived in the jungle is what clearly gave her the edge. She was able to push through when others may have given up. And so day after day, she would hike through the jungle. She used the riverbanks of the rivers to actually navigate, because it was easier to walk next to a river. And at times she would actually go into the river too. She has spoken about when she was in the river, actually seeing crocodiles in the river, but she knew through her experience that it was unlikely that a crocodile would attack a human. And so with that in mind, she kept on going in these water sources, knowing the chances of them attacking her were next to none. By day 10, Julianne's body had started to shut down. She hadn't eaten properly for those 10 days. She had barely drank. Her clothing was not suitable for the conditions at night, and the wounds that she was carrying were starting to get worse. The wound on the shoulder had started to become infected with maggots, and the shoulder injury, without proper treatment, was getting worse too. And in this hazy, disorientated state, she made her way up this river, and in the distance she could see a boat. And she wasn't sure whether this was a boat that was a real boat or not, because she wasn't with it. But she made her way towards it, suddenly to realize that it was a real boat. Now, there was nobody on the boat, but in the distance she could see a hut. And she knew that if she could just make it to the hut with shelter, if anybody was going to find her, this would be the place to go. So she struggled her way up the riverbank and finally made it into the hut. When she got inside, she could now start to tend to the wounds. Her arm with the maggots in was the first thing that she wanted to treat. And she remembered a story from when she was a child. She'd had a dog, and the dog had also got infected with maggots, and her father had poured kerosene on the wound, and that had killed the maggots. And so with that in mind, she started to look around the hut, and over in the distance she saw a gasoline tank, and she went over and there was gasoline in it, and she thought, you know what, it's not kerosene, but it will do. And so she bent down, she opened the cap, and she poured it onto the wound. The moment that she did that, she noticed an excruciating pain. The maggots started to bury deeper to try and get away from the gasoline. And so her response to that was to start picking out the maggots one after the other. Her recollection is that she removed 30 maggots from that particular wound. Now, Julianne didn't like the sleeping conditions inside the hut, and so that evening she took herself down to the riverbank and she stayed there. But the next morning she got up and she made her way back to the hut, and that's where she encountered some Peruvian men. They had heard about the plane tragedy and they were in the area, and luckily she spoke Spanish. So in conversation with them, she was able to tell them exactly what had happened, who she was, what had happened to her, and then they started to treat her wounds. They ended up spending the rest of the day there and stayed overnight, but the following day They put her in a canoe and they rowed her 10 miles down the river to the next village. She was taken to the nearest hospital and her injuries were treated. She was also questioned by the authorities and later on would go with them back into the jungle to say, "This is where I landed." The area was then combed for more survivors, but unfortunately there wasn't any. Julianne would be the only survivor of the 92 people on board that plane. Julianne's own mother Maria had actually survived the fall, along with a further 13 other people. All of those people had later succumbed to their injuries before they could be rescued. Now I guess we'll never know completely how Julianne survived the fall, but it has been theorised that as the seats fell towards the ground, they may have started spinning like so, and that this may have slowed down the descent. It's also been theorised that the updraft from the storm may have also contributed to that. Add to that, you've got the canopy of the trees above the forest. She would have ploughed into them, and that would have slowed her descent too. In the aftermath of this disaster, it would actually be determined that the plane that had fallen apart had been pieced together by bits of other planes. And add to that, Lanza's poor record in this industry led to them losing their license. This disaster would go down as the worst in history for a plane that was actually struck by lightning, and yet for its sole survivor, Julianne, she would carry on to live a full and happy life. Now, if that story isn't almost unbelievable, I don't know what is. Now, if you haven't subscribed, please do so. Also, the notification bell, that's really important. If you haven't turned that on, please do so now, and I'll see you all in the next one. Take care.